21 years ago, Frank Morrison signed a document that would haunt him forever. A paper denying paternity of a child he'd never even held. Today, that same child stood on his doorstep, and Frank's carefully built world was about to crumble. If you enjoy stories about second chances and family healing, feel free to subscribe. It really helps the channel. By the way, let me know in the comments. Where are you listening from? Frank Morrison wiped grease from his weathered hands as the sleek sedan pulled into his gravel driveway. The evening air in Cedar Falls, Iowa carried the scent of freshly cut grass and his neighbor's barbecue. But Frank's attention fixed on the young man stepping out of the car. Something about the stranger's confident stride and the way he held his shoulders made Frank's chest tighten with an inexplicable dread. "Mr. Morrison?" The young man's voice carried a slight tremor despite his composed appearance. He clutched a manila envelope against his pressed white shirt, his green eyes scanning Frank's face with desperate recognition. "I'm Michael Reed. I think you knew my mother, Sarah, 22 years ago." The wrench slipped from Frank's fingers, clattering against the concrete garage floor. Those eyes, he'd seen them in his mirror every morning for 45 years. The same emerald shade, the same determined set to the jaw, even the same way of tilting his head when asking a difficult question. Frank's throat went dry as memories he'd buried deep began clawing their way to the surface. Michael took a step closer, and Frank noticed the expensive cut of his clothes, the confident way he carried himself despite his obvious nervousness. This wasn't the broken, needy child Frank had imagined all these years. This was a successful young man who'd clearly made something of himself, and that realization somehow made everything worse. "I don't know what you're talking about," Frank said, but his voice cracked on the lie. He could see his own features reflected in the young man's face like a ghost from his past, and he suspected Michael could see the recognition in his eyes, too. Michael's face fell slightly, but he pressed on with quiet determination. "She said you might say that. She kept this all these years." He held up the envelope and Frank's blood turned to ice. He knew exactly what was inside, the same type of legal document he'd signed without even reading, desperate to make the problem disappear before Eleanor found out about his mistake. Frank stared at the envelope in Michael's hands, remembering the day he'd signed those papers 21 years ago. His signature on a paternity denial form, a legal declaration that he wanted nothing to do with this child. Looking at Michael now, successful and dignified despite everything, Frank felt shame wash over him like a physical blow. But fear ran deeper than shame, and old habits die hard. "You should go," Frank said quietly, turning back toward his truck. "Whatever you think happened, you're wrong." But Michael didn't leave. "Mr. Morrison, please. I don't want money or anything complicated. I just want to know why you didn't want me." The question hung in the evening air like a challenge Frank wasn't prepared to face. He could see Mrs. Hutchins peering through her kitchen window next door. Her curtains twitched aside just enough to get a clear view of the expensive car and well-dressed stranger. In a town like Cedar Falls, nothing stayed secret long, and Frank could already imagine the phone calls that would start before Michael even left his driveway. Frank reluctantly gestured toward his front door. 5 minutes. Then you leave and don't come back." Inside his cluttered living room, Frank was acutely aware of how the space looked through Michael's eyes. Family photos lined the mantel, but they only showed Frank and his late wife Eleanor. No children. No hint that Frank had ever been connected to anyone beyond his marriage. Michael's gaze lingered on these photos, and Frank saw him flinch at the obvious absence of any acknowledgement of his existence. "I've been looking for you since my adoptive parents died 6 months ago," Michael explained, settling uncomfortably on the edge of Frank's worn couch. "Car accident. They were good people, gave me everything I needed, but they always said someday I might want to find my biological family." Frank's hands fidgeted with a coffee mug, avoiding Michael's steady gaze. "And what did you find?" Michael pulled out a folded document, the original paternity denial, Frank's signature bold and careless at the bottom. "This, signed by Frank Morrison, denying any parental responsibility for Michael Reed, born March 15th. His voice remained steady, but Frank could hear the years of hurt beneath the composed surface. "I graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern, got accepted to 3 graduate programs, 1 academic scholarships. I turned out fine without you, but I still need to understand why my own father threw me away like garbage." The words hit Frank like physical blows. He'd never thought about the child who would grow up reading that document, never considered how those legal words would feel to the person they rejected. He'd only thought about protecting himself, his reputation, his comfortable life with Eleanor. "Your mother was young," Frank said finally, his voice defensive. "I was engaged. The timing was impossible." "So you just pretended I didn't exist?" Frank stood abruptly, moving toward the front door. It was the right choice for everyone involved. Michael followed him outside onto the front porch, his composure finally cracking. "Right for who? You got to keep your perfect life while she raised me alone for 3 years before giving me up for adoption. You got to sleep peacefully while I spent my childhood wondering what was so wrong with me that my own father didn't even want to meet me." Frank's jaw tightened as he saw himself through his son's eyes for the first time. Not as a man who'd made a difficult choice, but as a coward who'd abandoned his responsibilities. The truth of it burned in his chest, but admitting it would mean facing everything he'd spent 2 decades trying to forget. Michael reached into his jacket and pulled out a second envelope, dropping it on Frank's porch table with quiet dignity. "College graduation photos, academic awards. I thought maybe you'd want to see who I became, but I guess I was wrong about that too." Frank stared at the envelope, afraid to touch it. Inside were images of the man his son had become without him. Achievements and milestones Frank had no part in, successes he couldn't claim. The weight of 21 years of absence pressed down on him like a physical burden. "You should go," Frank said again, but this time his voice lacked conviction. Michael nodded slowly, his green eyes, so much like Frank's own, filled with disappointment rather than anger. "I should have known better than to hope." He walked toward his car, then turned back one final time. "For what it's worth, she never spoke badly of you. Even at the end, she said you were probably just scared." As Michael's sedan disappeared down the street, Frank remained on his porch, staring at the envelope his son had left behind. Mrs. Hutchins was still at her window, and he could see lights coming on in other houses where neighbors had noticed the unusual visitor. By morning, the whole town would be talking, and Frank's carefully guarded secret would be exposed for everyone to examine and judge. The next morning, Murphy's Diner felt different the moment Frank walked through the familiar glass doors. Conversations quieted, and he caught fragments of whispered words. "Always wondered. Looks just like Frank." Eleanor never knew. Betty Murphy approached his usual corner booth with coffee, her weathered face wearing an expression Frank had never seen before, disappointment mixed with something that might have been pity. "Morning, Frank," she said, setting down his mug with deliberate care. Heard you had a visitor yesterday. Frank's hands wrapped around the warm ceramic, grateful for something to occupy them. News travels fast. In a town this size, everything travels fast. Betty's tone carried 20 years of friendship, but also a new distance that made Frank's stomach clench. That young man looked familiar to some folks. Around the diner, Frank could feel eyes on him, measuring his reactions, cataloging his responses for later discussion. The comfortable anonymity he'd enjoyed in Cedar Falls was evaporating with each passing moment, replaced by the uncomfortable weight of public scrutiny. The bell above the entrance chimed, and Frank looked up to see Michael walking into the diner. The breakfast crowd fell silent as every person in the room shifted their gaze between father and son, noting the unmistakable similarities in their faces, their builds, the way they both unconsciously straightened their shoulders when feeling cornered. Michael approached Frank's table with determined steps, sliding into the opposite booth seat without invitation. His presence commanded the room's attention in a way that made Frank's skin crawl with embarrassment. "We need to talk," Michael said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent diner. Frank could feel every pair of eyes in the room focused on their table, every ear straining to catch their conversation. The weight of public scrutiny pressed down on him like a physical force, making his collar feel tight around his neck. "Not here," Frank muttered, starting to rise from his seat. But Michael's hand shot out, gripping Frank's wrist with surprising strength. "Yes, here. You've been hiding from this conversation for 21 years. I'm not letting you run away again." The desperation in his son's voice cut through Frank's defenses, but the embarrassment of being confronted in front of the entire town burned hotter than his guilt. Frank yanked his arm free, his face flushing red as he became aware of phones being discreetly pulled from pockets, ready to capture whatever drama was about to unfold. 21 years, I wondered if I was worth loving," Michael continued, his voice rising with each word. 21 years, I asked myself what was so fundamentally wrong with me that my own father signed papers saying he wanted nothing to do with me. And you can't even give me 5 minutes of honesty? Frank's shame transformed into anger. Anger at being cornered, at having his private business aired in front of people he'd have to face every day for the rest of his life. "You want honesty? Fine. I was 24 years old, engaged to a woman I loved, and your mother was a mistake. A one-night mistake that I couldn't let destroy everything I'd built." The words hung in the air like poison, and Frank immediately regretted them. Michael's face went pale, then flushed with hurt and rage. Around them, the diner patrons shifted uncomfortably, some looking away in embarrassment, while others leaned forward, hungry for more drama. "A mistake," Michael repeated quietly, his voice trembling. "That's what I am to you. A mistake." Frank tried to backtrack, seeing the pain in his son's eyes, but the damage was done. He'd spoken from wounded pride rather than truth, and now he'd hurt the one person who'd had the courage to seek him out. Betty Murphy appeared at their table like a guardian angel, her weathered hands carrying a fresh pot of coffee but her eyes blazing with righteous indignation. "Frank Morrison," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "It's time you heard what this town has been whispering about for over 2 decades. Frank looked up at Betty, his stomach dropping at her tone. In 20 years of morning coffee and casual conversation, he'd never heard her speak with such disappointed authority. The entire diner seemed to hold its breath, waiting for whatever revelation was coming. "Betty, please," Frank started, but she cut him off with a sharp look. "No, Frank. This boy came here looking for answers, and he deserves the truth, not just your version of it." Betty set the coffee pot down with deliberate force. "Half this town suspected Michael was your son when Sarah was pregnant. We watched her walking Main Street with her belly growing, working double shifts at the grocery store to save money, never asking anyone for help." Michael's eyes widened as he absorbed this information. Frank felt the walls of his carefully constructed reality crumbling around him. "Sarah never asked you for money, did she, Frank?" Betty continued relentlessly. "Never called you. Never showed up at your door demanding support. She moved to Chicago to protect your precious reputation and your engagement to Eleanor. That girl faced pregnancy and childbirth completely alone while you went on with your comfortable life like nothing had happened." Frank's mouth went dry. He'd always told himself that Sarah's silence meant she didn't want him involved, that his denial of paternity was somehow mutual. Learning that she'd sacrificed her connection to her hometown to protect him made his cowardice appear even more shameful. "And you know what we all thought?" Betty's voice rose slightly, drawing nods from several other patrons. "We thought Sarah Reed was the finest young woman this town ever produced, and you let her face it all alone, because you were too much of a coward to take responsibility for your actions." The condemnation in Betty's voice reflected what Frank now realized had been the town's opinion of him for over 20 years. They hadn't been fooled by his secret. They'd simply been too polite to confront him directly. Until now. Michael stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the worn linoleum floor. His face had gone ashen, and Frank could see him struggling to maintain his composure in front of the room full of strangers who apparently knew more about his story than he did. "I came here hoping to find a father," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the silent diner. "But I see I was right to stop hoping years ago." Frank watched helplessly as his son walked toward the door, every instinct screaming at him to follow, to explain, to somehow fix what he'd just broken. But paralyzed by shame and the weight of 20 years of lies, he remained frozen in his seat as the diner door swung shut behind Michael with a finality that felt like a death knell. That evening, alone in his garage workshop, Frank found himself searching through boxes he hadn't touched in decades. Dust motes danced in the overhead light as he pushed aside old tools and forgotten projects, driven by a compulsion he couldn't quite name. Finally, in the back corner behind a stack of tire rims, he found what he was looking for, a small shoebox wrapped in faded twine. Inside the box were 7 letters, their envelopes yellowed with age but still sealed. Each one bore Sarah's careful handwriting, Frank Morrison, in blue ink, with return addresses that tracked her move from Cedar Falls to Chicago and then to various apartments in the city. The postmarks ranged from during her pregnancy through Michael's early childhood. Frank had never opened them. When they arrived, he'd been too afraid Eleanor would find them, too terrified of what they might contain. Demands for money, accusations, threats to expose their affair. So he'd hidden them away like evidence of a crime, telling himself he was protecting his marriage and his reputation. Now, with trembling hands, he opened the first letter. Sarah's voice seemed to speak from the page, gentle and understanding rather than accusatory. She wrote about her pregnancy, her decision to move away, her hope that someday Frank might want to know about their child. There was no anger, no demands, just a young woman trying to navigate an impossible situation with grace and dignity. The letters chronicled Michael's birth, his first words, his first steps. Sarah described a bright, curious child who asked endless questions and showed an early aptitude for learning. She wrote about his adoptive parents, a kind couple who couldn't have children of their own, but promised to love Michael as if he were born to them. The final letter, dated just 3 years ago, revealed that Sarah had been diagnosed with cancer. In careful, measured words, she asked Frank to watch over Michael from a distance if anything happened to her adoptive family. She'd somehow known that Michael would eventually find himself alone and might need the father who had denied him. "I never blamed you for being scared," she wrote in her final paragraph. "We were both so young, and I understood the impossible position we were in. I just want you to know that our son is extraordinary, kind, brilliant, and stronger than either of us ever were. If he ever finds you, please see him for who he's become, not what you were afraid he might be." Frank's hands shook as he folded the letter, finally understanding the magnitude of what he'd lost through his own cowardice. Sarah had trusted him with their son's future, even after he'd failed them both so completely. She'd believed he might still have the capacity to do right by Michael, even when Frank had never shown evidence of such character. The next morning, Frank tracked Michael down at the Cedar Falls Community College Library, where he'd learned from Betty Murphy that the young man was researching graduate programs on the public computers. Frank found him hunched over a desk in the reference section, surrounded by printouts and application materials. "Michael," Frank said quietly, not wanting to startle him in the hushed library atmosphere. Michael looked up, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and stress. "What do you want now? Haven't you humiliated me enough?" Frank pulled out a chair across from Michael's desk, his movements careful and deliberate. "I read your mother's letters. All of them. I should have read them 21 years ago." Something in Frank's tone made Michael pause in his shuffling of papers. "What letters?" "7 letters she sent me. I was too scared to open them back then, afraid of what she might want from me. But she never wanted anything except for me to know about you." Frank's voice caught slightly. "She wrote about your first steps, your first words. She told me you had her smile and my stubborn streak. She was proud of you every single day." Michael's defensive posture softened slightly, though wariness remained in his green eyes. "She talked about you sometimes, never with anger, which I could never understand. She said you were probably just scared, and that fear makes people do things they regret." "She was right about the regret," Frank admitted. "And she was right about being scared. I've been scared my whole life. Scared of responsibility. Scared of failing. Scared of people seeing who I really am underneath all my pretending." For the first time since they'd met, Michael's expression held something other than hurt or anger. Frank saw a flicker of curiosity, maybe even sympathy, before Michael's phone rang, shattering the fragile moment of connection between them. Michael glanced at the caller ID, his face immediately shifting to confusion and concern. "It's a law office in Chicago. I need to take this." Frank watched as his son answered the call, his heart sinking as Michael's face grew increasingly pale with each passing moment. Whatever news was coming from Chicago, it wasn't good, and Frank had a terrible feeling that he was about to lose his second chance before it had truly begun. Michael's face drained of color as he listened to the voice on the other end of the phone. Frank watched helplessly as his son's shoulders sagged with each passing moment, the confident posture he'd maintained throughout their difficult encounters finally cracking under whatever devastating news was being delivered. "Yes, I understand," Michael said quietly into the phone. "How much exactly?" A long pause. All of it? But the insurance? Another pause. Longer this time. I see. Yes. I'll need to handle this immediately. Frank felt his chest tighten as he watched Michael's carefully constructed future crumble in real time. The young man who had walked into his life 2 days ago with dignity and purpose was transforming before his eyes into someone lost and overwhelmed. Michael ended the call and sat staring at his phone screen, his hands trembling slightly. The graduate school applications scattered across the library table suddenly seemed like artifacts from someone else's life. What happened? Frank asked gently, though he dreaded the answer. My adoptive parents, Michael said, his voice hollow. They died with massive debts, credit cards, a second mortgage they took out for my college expenses, medical bills from my mother's treatment for diabetes. The lawyer says I'm responsible for everything as their heir. He looked up at Frank with eyes that seemed decades older than they had moments before. My college fund, my savings, everything I worked for, it's all gone. More than gone. I owe $60,000 I don't have. Frank's heart broke watching his son absorb the magnitude of his losses. Not only had Michael lost his adoptive parents, but now he was losing his future as well. The graduate programs, the career prospects, the life he'd built through years of academic excellence. All of it was disappearing because of circumstances completely beyond his control. I'll have to drop out of the master's program before it even starts, Michael continued, mechanically gathering his application materials into a neat stack. Find work immediately. Maybe I can pay it off in 5 or 6 years if I'm lucky. Frank watched Michael preparing to leave Cedar Falls forever, accepting defeat with the same quiet dignity he'd shown throughout their encounter. The young man was prepared to sacrifice his dreams to honor his adoptive parents' memory, even though their financial irresponsibility wasn't his fault. Wait, Frank said suddenly, standing up from the library table. Just wait here for an hour. Please. Michael looked up at him with weary confusion. Why? Frank was already moving toward the library exit, driven by an impulse he couldn't fully explain. Because some mistakes cost more than money, and this one has cost me 21 years with my son. 30 minutes later, Frank sat across from Tom Bradley in the loan officer's cramped office at Cedar Falls Community Bank. Tom had been Eleanor's cousin, and he'd handled the mortgage when Frank bought his house 15 years ago. Now he looked at Frank with concerned confusion as he reviewed the loan application. Frank, this doesn't make sense, Tom said, adjusting his glasses as he studied the paperwork. You want to liquidate all your savings and take a second mortgage against Eleanor's house? That's your only real asset. If something goes wrong, you could lose everything. Frank's hands were steady as he signed document after document. Eleanor's been gone 3 years, Tom. The house is just a building now. But my son is alive and he needs help. Your son? Tom's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Frank, I never knew you had... Nobody knew. That was the problem. Frank signed the final paper with deliberate force. I let fear make my choices for 21 years. I'm not doing that anymore. Tom processed the loan with obvious reluctance, warning Frank repeatedly about the financial risks he was taking. Frank barely heard him. All he could think about was Michael sitting in that library, resigning himself to abandoning his dreams because he had nowhere else to turn. When Frank returned to the library with a cashier's check for $65,000, he found Michael exactly where he'd left him, staring at his closed laptop with defeated acceptance. Here, Frank said, placing the check on the table between them. Michael looked at the check, then at Frank, then back at the check. What is this? Enough to pay off your debts and fund your graduate program, with a little left over for living expenses. Michael pushed the check away like it might burn him. I don't want your charity. I don't want your guilt money. It's not charity, Frank said firmly. It's 21 years of missed birthday presents, Christmas gifts, college graduation congratulations, and everything else a father should have provided. Consider it back payments on a debt I never acknowledged. Michael stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. You think you can just write a check and fix 21 years of abandonment? You think money erases what you did to us? Their raised voices drew disapproving looks from other library patrons, but Frank pressed on. I think a father should help his son when he's in trouble, even if that father has been the worst kind of coward. You're not my father. Michael's voice cracked with emotion. You signed papers saying so, remember? You made that choice 21 years ago, and you don't get to change your mind now just because it's convenient. Frank felt something break open inside his chest. 21 years of suppressed grief and regret pouring out in a rush of desperate honesty. You want to know why I really signed those papers? It wasn't about Eleanor or my reputation or any of the excuses I've been telling myself. Michael stopped moving toward the exit, caught by something raw in Frank's voice. My father walked out on me when I was 12 years old. Frank continued, his voice shaking. Left my mother and me with nothing but unpaid bills and a house we couldn't afford. I spent my entire childhood believing that if I'd been a better son, maybe he wouldn't have left. When your mother told me she was pregnant, all I could think about was how terrified I was that I'd be just like him, that I'd fail you the way he failed me. Michael turned around slowly, his anger replaced by something more complex. Surprise. Maybe even understanding. I convinced myself that signing those papers would save you from having a coward for a father. But all I did was make you feel abandoned, just like I felt. I gave you the same wounds my father gave me, and I've regretted it every single day for 21 years. The library fell silent around them. Frank realized he was crying, tears he'd held back for 2 decades finally finding their release. Michael stared at him with an expression Frank couldn't read, processing this revelation about the grandfather he'd never known and the fears that had shaped his father's terrible choice. I don't know how to be a good father, Frank admitted. I never learned how. But I know my son is in trouble and I have the means to help him. That's not charity. That's what parents do. Michael looked down at the check again, then back at Frank's tear-streaked face. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Michael sat back down at the library table, his movements slow and careful. Tell me about him, Michael said quietly. Your father. My grandfather. Over the next hour, Frank told Michael stories he'd never shared with anyone, about the man who taught him to change oil and throw a baseball, then disappeared one morning without even leaving a note. He talked about the fear that had governed his choices, the way abandonment had shaped his inability to trust his own capacity for love. Michael listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that showed he understood the connection between his grandfather's failures and his father's fears. Slowly, tentatively, he began sharing his own stories, about growing up wondering if his biological father had abandoned him because he wasn't worth loving, about the academic achievements he'd pursued, partly to prove he was worthy of the love he'd never received. As the afternoon sun slanted through the library windows, father and son discovered they shared more than just green eyes and stubborn streaks. They both carried wounds from abandonment, Both had tried to prove their worth through achievement. Both had spent years wondering if they were fundamentally unlovable. "The money isn't about fixing the past," Frank said finally. "It's about giving you the future your mother wanted you to have. She believed in you even when I was too scared to try." Michael picked up the check with trembling fingers. "If I accept this, it doesn't mean I forgive you. It doesn't mean we're suddenly a happy family." "I know," Frank said, "but maybe it means we can try to figure out what we could be, if you're willing." Michael nodded slowly, folding the check and putting it in his wallet. "I'd like to hear more about her, about my mother, about the woman you both were too young and scared to appreciate properly." Frank smiled through his tears. "She would have been so proud of the man you became. She always said you were stronger than both of us combined." As they walked out of the library together, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in 21 years. Hope. Not for easy forgiveness or instant reconciliation, but for the possibility that love could still find a way to bridge the gap his fear had created. The next morning, Frank found Michael on his front porch, holding 2 cups of coffee from Murphy's Diner and looking uncertain but determined. "I thought maybe," Michael said, offering Frank one of the cups, "you could show me some of those pictures you mentioned, the ones of my mother." Frank accepted the coffee gratefully, recognizing the gesture for what it was. Not forgiveness, but a beginning. They sat on the porch steps as Frank pulled out his phone, scrolling through old photos he'd kept but never looked at. "This was taken at the county fair," Frank said, showing Michael a picture of Sarah laughing on a carnival ride. "She was fearless about everything except spiders. Made me kill them for her, even though she was braver than I ever was about everything that actually mattered." Michael studied the photo intently, searching for traces of himself in his mother's features. "She looks happy." She was. She had this way of finding joy in small things. Sunsets, good music, the smell of rain. "I think you got that from her." They spent the morning trading stories and sharing memories, building tentative bridges across 21 years of silence. It wasn't forgiveness yet, and it wasn't a fairy tale reunion, but it was 2 people choosing to try. Mrs. Hutchins watched them from her kitchen window, and for the first time in days, she was smiling. The Morrison family was finally beginning to heal.